Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Workers' Party of Britain meeting with George Galloway. Tonight, we're going to be covering the subject of the state and revolution. So without any further ado, let's go over to George.
Comrades and friends, comrades of the
Hello,
Workers'
George. We
Party
can't
of
hear
Britain,
yet.
watching on Zoom, and those friends that we hope will become comrades in the Workers' Party of Britain who are watching on other platforms. Permit me a slight digression in the beginning, if you will. In any case, the remarks I'd like to make are not antithetical in any way to the main burden of tonight's
Sorry,
topic.
George, we're having some... George, you are unmuted. Can we just try that again?
Okay, I hope it's better this time. Thanks very much for joining us. The members of the...
Oh, God. Okay. Right.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You hearing me, Rob?
Please continue.
Thank you. Sorry about the technical difficulties. We've been remarkably lucky in the Zoom meetings we've held up to now. Something like 500,000 people have watched the meetings that we've had up till now, which is very good going for a small and new party. Obviously, the members are watching on Zoom and can participate, and we hope those watching on the other platforms will join us before long. It's a very big public meeting every Tuesday night without leaving home. And on a Wednesday, we have meetings that are more interactive, less talk from the top table, as it were. And I think members are finding both of these meetings useful. I hope you'll permit me a digression before passing on to the main burden of my remarks. In any case, I think the comments I'm about to make do not detract in any way from the main issue that we are discussing this evening, which is the state, the nature of the state and how to change it, the state and revolution. But I said last week, and I think also the week before, that I had a feeling 2020 was going to be an epochal year. It was going to be a transformative year. And I said last week that there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. And quite clearly, the past weeks have been pregnant with very many fundamental issues coming, bubbling like hot geysers to the surface, and none more so than the issue of race and the issue of Britain's imperial history. Now, I want to make, I think, our party's position clear. There should never have been a statue and many other emblematic areas of Bristol called after a slave trader who was also a Conservative MP and therefore a perfect target for our ire. He was a man who transported 100,000 black Africans chained in the holds of ships, at least 10,000 of whom perished en route, their bodies thrown into the sea, and therefore I could think of no more fitting end for Edward Colson than to be torn down from his undeserved statue and plunged into the sea that he had himself once flecked with the blood of black African slaves. But this has thrown up a very spirited debate, a more fierce debate than I have seen for some time in Britain about our imperial past, from which slavery cannot, of course, be separated. In fact, the British Empire, in part, became great because of our role in the enslavement of black Africans and their exporting from Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean as labor that literally toiled for free and whose children became the property of their owners. This is a very inglorious chapter. It matters not that other people had been slavers before us. It matters not that other ruling elites, even in Europe, were even more horrifically brutal than ours. I see the statue of Leopold of the Belgium being carted off his plinth also in the last day or so. He's a man who personally, not the state, but he personally owned what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, for the liberation of which Che Guevara himself fought alongside Patrice Lumumba, the greatest of all African leaders, and therefore, of course, murdered by imperialism, British imperialism at that. So the fact that the Belgians, or that the Arabs before them, or the African chiefs sold their people into slavery, none of these are our business. Our business is to have a reckoning with our ruling class. Our business is to have a reckoning with our history. And we intend to do that as, I believe, the most clear anti-imperialist force in Britain. The Workers' Party will not shirk from this. We do not deny in any way the special oppression, the special exploitation suffered by the descendants of those black slaves. We believe that the special oppression of these workers is best confronted by the workers as a whole. Because, of course, racism does not just affect its victims, it affects those, the rest of the population who are not black or Irish or Chinese or Jewish or any of the other scapegoats that are plucked by capitalism, by imperialism, for a whipping at the stake. The black workers, you can say, as Malcolm, to paraphrase Malcolm, have the knife 6 inches into their backs, and we who have the knife merely 4.5 inches are not to be grateful for that 1.5 inches. It's our job to persuade everyone, the victims and the non-victims, including those who side with the witch hunting of the victims, that we are all victims of the same system which deliberately uses racism. It's an indispensable part of its armory, deliberately uses racism to divide the working class so that the working class cannot unite and confront its real enemy. And as always, its real enemy is at home. So I wanted to make these remarks in case there was any doubt about where we stand. I'm sure that Mr. Coulson's likeness will be retrieved from the harbour in Bristol, not least because where there's muck, there's brass. And in this case, Mr. Coulson is made of bronze. And the price of scrap bronze is quite tidy these days, they tell me. Thousands of pounds a ton. So I'm sure he'll be rescued from the ignominy of his current residence in the water in Bristol, but he must not be reinstated. And any attempt to reinstate this particular slaver to his place of preeminence in Bristol should be resolutely opposed by everyone, and the Workers' Party will play its part in opposing that. And insofar as the events of the last couple of weekends have focused on other great British imperialists, we welcome the debate that has ensued. It's always seemed passing strange to me that someone like Cecil Rhodes can lord it over Oxford University, admittedly several feet above the ground where it's not easy to reach him. And there are many other street names, park names, names of institutions. Dundas Street in Glasgow, for example, called after a famous Glasgow slaver. Innumerable streets in Liverpool that are called after slave traders because, of course, they gave a little bit, and I'm sure it was only a little bit, of their ill-gotten gains to what they called philanthropy in those days. As I put it today, Edward Coulson was to philanthropy exactly what Jimmy Savile was to charity. And nobody in their right mind would object to a statue of Jimmy Savile being torn down once an understanding of his actual life had been reached by the mass of the people, and nobody should be shedding any tears over the philanthropist who is in the drink in Bristol. Now, turning to the subject of today, again I shall concentrate on the British state, although much of what I have to say applies to any state, every state, except for one or two exceptions, like Cuba, to an extent like China, and other states that are no longer with us. This that I'm about to say is applicable, I'm sure, to other states. But we are the Workers' Party of Britain, and our special responsibility is to confront the imperialist state in Britain. So let me start by what we mean by state. We are not anarchists, far from it. We are not people who don't believe in a state, the state. We are not those who want to abolish the police, who want to abolish the armed forces. In fact, if we were in power, there'd be a bigger army, not a smaller one. It would be a people's army, and its purpose would not be to attack other people, but to deter other people from attacking us. And its purpose would be to assist in the building of socialism in our country. So we are not amongst those nihilists, anarchists, ultra-leftists of various stripes who don't want to have a state. And you'll have noticed by now the extraordinary confluence, apparently paradoxically, between right-wing libertarians who don't want a state at all, who want the smallest possible state, and the ultra-left and anarchist elements who want exactly the same. We are not from that tradition, but we do stand for a very different role for the state than the role that it plays today. So what role does it play today? I remember commenting to someone who should have known better, who was lamenting the coronavirus lockdown as being a threat to our liberties. I remember asking that person, what liberties have we got? It's true that through a process of reform and much struggle, we have inched forward as a people in gaining some rights. But in part, those rights were able to be conceded by the capitalist state precisely because they did not existentially challenge it. In other words, those reforms, welcome no doubt, did not change the basic fundamentals of the distribution of wealth and power in our country. Moreover, most of those rights were given, won, or given, and or given, at a time when an actual ideological existential threat was thought to exist in the world, namely communism, and our rulers were ready to grant some rights, some liberties, as a tactical acknowledgement of the need to avoid the British people becoming attracted to an entirely different method of organization and ownership of wealth and power in our country. And as soon as that existential thought, that existential challenge that was thought to exist, ceased to exist, it's no accident that many of these rights, many of these liberties have withered on the vine or even been taken away from us altogether. It is also the case that it was vital for the state to have an opposition in a safe pair of hands. As long as the opposition to Edward Heath was Harold Wilson or James Callaghan, both of them, especially the latter, absolutely committed to the essentials of Britain's role in the world, then democratic space, limited though it was, could be afforded. The British state could afford Labour governments from time to time because they posed no challenge to the essentials of the current dispensation of the prevailing orthodoxy. And this explains the near hysteria in the 4 years and a bit of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. Suddenly the state was no longer confident that if Labour was elected under Corbyn, that they could be guaranteed to continue with the essentials. The essentials being the overwhelmingly private ownership of the British economy, the overwhelming benefit of that economy continuing to go to the 1%, or as Chris Hedges rightly points out, the 0.1%, and continuing Britain's role in the world as a faithful auxiliary, a leading and faithful auxiliary of imperialist politics led by the United States of America. For a brief moment, the ruling class was not sure. Now, I think they were overestimating Jeremy Corbyn, to be perfectly honest. I think they were more afraid of him than they needed to be. But they are nervous people. After all, there's a lot at stake here. The well-being of the 0.1%, the importance of the imperialist camp in the world is not something you loosely take chances with. And so they moved heaven and earth to destroy Corbyn, utilizing all of the weapons in their armory, including the weapons of the deep state itself. The deep state is the permanent guarantor of the stability, they hope permanent, of British capitalism, of British imperialism. And if you had half a brain, you would already worked out that the assaults on Corbyn in the media were being fed by the interests of the deep state, the agents of the deep state, utilizing usually, but not always, retired leaders of the deep state. So former heads of MI5, former heads of MI6, former generals, former field marshals were all deployed by the state to destroy Corbyn. Although it got so risky at one point that actual serving military officers were enabled with their face on screen and their name underneath it to threaten mutiny, to threaten rebellion in the state should there be any Jeremy Corbyn government. And people were named as being unacceptable to the military, Seamus Milne in particular. It was openly stated by a British military officer that Milne would not be allowed to have security clearance and therefore could not advise Corbyn should Corbyn become Prime Minister, and would therefore have to dispense with him. And that showed you how nervous they were about one of the rights which the state had given us. And that right was being the right to elect an alternative government. That's what they call democracy. A choice between Tweedledee and Tweedledum, between one cheek and another cheek of the same arse. A polity in which you can argue about the color of the paint in the departments in Whitehall. You can argue about tuppence halfpenny on or off the income tax, but nothing must be allowed to touch the fundamental interests of the state. And that's why, with this recent experience, I could go back further in history and give other examples. I am here to state that we have no permanent liberties. Even if we had a written constitution, the American people are finding right now that even having your liberties written down in a document to which everyone supposedly defers, these liberties can be shredded in an instant, even without guns having to be brought onto the streets. At the stroke of a parliamentary pen, at the stroke even of a governmental pen, never mind a parliamentary one, things that we thought were permanent liberties can be abolished, shredded, set aside for as long as the ruling elite considers them to be necessarily put into the deep freeze, perhaps never to be brought out again. The only guarantee of liberty is revolution. The only guarantee of permanently being in control of our own lives, masters of our own destiny, is revolution, is a revolutionary change, a complete change. That's what we mean. That's what revolution means. It doesn't mean an inch this way or that way. It doesn't mean reforms, though we welcome good reforms. But we say reforms are not enough. Reforms can be reversed. Reforms from an unchanged state can be withdrawn by the state which conceded them in the first place. And therefore we pose the question of revolution. In this sense, we want to fundamentally change the character of Britain. We want to end the existence of the 0.1%. We want to take command of the great heights of the British economy in the interests of the people, in the interests of the public. We believe that the economy should be not something done to the people, but the economy should be owned by the people and should operate for the people. And that's a revolutionary demand, which no party with a prospect of power in Britain, even in the last 100 years of democracy in Britain, less than 100 years, I make that point in parenthesis, having just been helping my son with his homework, Britain was not a democracy until 1929 by any standards. The mass of women in Britain did not get the vote until 1929. All those soldiers that were fighting in the trenches for king and country didn't even have a vote to elect the government of the country that they were fighting for. But even in that brief period of less than 100 years of universal suffrage, no party that had a prospect of power posed that revolutionary question. Whom? Who owns the country? And for whom is the country owned? And we in the Workers' Party are seriously advancing these questions. We intend, if we were ever in a position to do so, and we will die fighting for it, even if we never reach it, to end Britain's role as an imperialist power, either in its own right or as an auxiliary of the bigger empire led by the United States. We fight for a Britain that has no designs on any other country's territory or resources. We believe in a Britain that is prepared to trade and befriend all and be an enemy to none, unless they should choose to be an enemy of us. And so here I turn to a point I made at our Birmingham rally. And I myself grew up in such a household, although my parents were Labourites. I grew up in a household in which it was imagined that the state was somehow a neutral arbiter between Labour and the Conservatives, between the ideas of socialism and the ideas of capitalism. But that has never been true. How could it be true? It's the fact, which speaks more about the other institutions than it does about the judiciary. It's a fact that the British judiciary is less corrupted than the other institutions of the state. But that doesn't mean it's not corrupt. Its fundamental role is to defend things as they are. I remember being shocked as a child at the 30-year sentences handed out to people who robbed a mail train, the Great Train Robbery, which was vastly in excess of the sentence that you would have been given for many other much more heinous crimes than robbing a mail train. And I realized as I got older that the reason why the judiciary and the police will defend the rich and defend the status quo is because they are an indispensable part of that status quo. What is the state at the end of the day but an armed body of men? In the end, that's what the state is, with a monopoly of violence in the territory of the state. And so, although mercifully we don't ourselves yet suffer these things, if it were necessary, and it has been necessary in the past, the tanks and the army would be on the streets oppressing us, as we have seen them do in many other countries. The judiciary has a certain upper class noblesse oblige from time to time, and we hope that higher up the judicial tree, Julian Assange will benefit from that. But essentially, the judiciary and the police and the army exist in the end, in the final analysis, to defend the interests of the ruling class in this country. And the only way that that will change is if we can build a mass movement of millions, tens of millions of people who demand a transfer of power from our elite to the working class itself. Now, we are a long, long way away from that, though don't forget my point about weeks and decades that I made earlier. But know it. Know that the different sinews of the state. Let's take another one, the BBC. I was brought up to trust the BBC, at least by comparison with its competitors. But I'd rather trust the Disney Channel nowadays than the BBC, because the BBC has been forced to cast aside its pretense of neutrality, its pretense of objectivity, in order to defend the core interests of the state. And that was, of course, demonstrated vividly in 1926 in the general strike, when the ruling class feared working class revolution It was demonstrated vividly in the miners' strike of 1984-85, and it was vividly demonstrated again during the brief interregnum of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. The police, the army, the judiciary, the BBC, the civil service, all of them are organs of state power. And state power is something much more permanent and different from democracy. What we call democracy, in any case, is, of course, hotly disputed by us. We don't believe that democracy is putting a cross on a piece of paper every 5 years and then going home to wait for the next 5 years to get the chance to do it again. When the choice is between, and is ensured that the choice is between, a Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's why our rulers can describe America as a democracy and Cuba as not a democracy. Even though Cuba is run by the people in the interests of the people, and America is run by one of two billionaires who've each spent $1 billion in the presidential election, having rigged the system to ensure that only one or other of those can be the president. This is a laughable description, calling America a democracy. Equally laughable is calling Cuba undemocratic, because in Cuba the economy is run for the people equally. The army is the army of the people. The police are the people's police. The social organizations run the country. The committees for the defense of the revolution in the neighborhoods, in the streets, in the buildings. I've lived there. I saw them. They run the country. That's what democracy is, the people running the country for the interests of the people. There's no ruling elite in Cuba, despite whatever propaganda you are told. I lived in a tenement building with the son of Che Guevara. Most people in the world don't even know he's got a son. Still less that he's got a son that looks just like him, but who goes to work every day in the foreign ministry at that time, I don't know what it is now, for $30 a month. The same salary drawn by the Comandante Fidel Castro himself. Because all of the cadre earn $30 a month. Because money in Cuba does not mean the same as it means in capitalist countries, where you have free medicine, free schooling, free universities, food, breakfast and lunch for the children at the school, where the ballet and the opera and the classical music and sport and all these things are available to the mass of the people for free, because that's what the country exists for. That's what the state exists for. So we believe in a strong state. If we ever come to power, we will have a strong state. Make no mistake about that. If you are a libertarian or an anarchist, we're not for you. We believe in order. We believe in discipline. But above all, we believe in unity, which takes me now back to the first points that I was making. There can be no liberation for women under capitalism. There can be no liberation for black people under capitalism. It follows, therefore, that we must get rid of the system that we live under, in which discrimination, bigotry, hatred, division, rancor, suspicion, and all the things we see around us are an indispensable tool in the hands of the ruling class. The only way that any section of our people can liberate itself is when we all liberate ourselves in total as a people. And thus, whilst of course at this time, above all, we say Black Lives Matter, but that doesn't mean that all lives don't matter. Black Lives Matter, I saw a good way of putting it today. If your wife asks you if you love her, it would not be the right answer to say, I love everybody. If your colleague tells you their father died, it is not the right answer to say everybody's father dies. We say Black Lives Matter because it's black lives that are on the line right now. But we also have a responsibility to say to black people and to their most militant allies that only by uniting black and white to fight capitalism and imperialism can we be truly free. Thanks, Rob, for your indulgence. I'm happy, as always, to take questions.
Thank you very much, George. That was an excellent presentation there, covering this subject, which is something that we're all going to benefit from discussing and getting to grips with. We have some questions that have come in. Joshua, I'm going to unmute you. You put your hand forward.
Oh, hi there. Yeah, can you see me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yes.
And do you want me to put the visual on, or are you happy to just hear?
I know well what you look like. You're a good friend of mine. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, and without meaning to sound overly controversial, the irony is about so many historical figures that would be deemed white supremacists, like Adolf Hitler, for example. I mean, I think he's probably the best example we could, or the worst example that humanity has to offer, the worst example. Most of his victims were, in fact, white Caucasian. The greatest irony in his racial policies was that most of his victims looked somewhat like him, although he had a very distinct appearance. Do you see the irony in how racists, bigots, they devalue everybody, really? It's just that there are certain people that they will happily use as a channel to devalue humanity as a whole. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yes, and it's a very good and interesting point, Josh. Of course, Hitler fascism was not so much white supremacist as Aryan and Germanic supremacist. It despised the white people of the hinterland of Germany, despised Slavs, for example. It despised Poles. It despised Russians. It thought all of them subhuman. And although it had an alliance with Mussolini, I doubt if they fancied the Italians much either. They seemed to have some sense of fellow feeling with the British Empire, although they, and at one stage they were ready to parley with it as long as they could be crowned the kings of occupied Europe. But other than the British, the German Nazis hated everybody, and they hated no group of white people more than they hated Jewish people, every last one of whom they were determined to annihilate, extirpate from the face of the earth, which goes to show that racism is a never-ending process. You can start off as a white supremacist, but before long, you don't quite rate the white guy in the other country because he's not quite as white as you, which shows the madness, of course, of racism. But mad or not, it's a useful tool. Hitler came to power by victimizing not just the Jews, but primarily the Jews, as the whipping boys, the scapegoats of Germany's ills. Hitler came to power by demonizing all kinds of sections of the German population, which he had identified as weak, as subhuman, like disabled people, for example, like gay people, like gypsies, Romanis, Jews, and so on. But of course, what German fascism was intent on doing was on protecting and enhancing and fabulously enriching German capitalism. They were German capitalism's last resort. And fascism remains the last resort of capitalism. And that's why we need a mass movement of people in order to be sure that real democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, can ever be realized.
Thank you, George. That's a great and very thorough response to that contribution there. Christina, I'll come to you next.
I would like to clap. The whole discussion makes my heart vibrate and my intellect vibrate, because George, you are putting back into the political discourse the word revolution, not as an empty slogan, but as the victory of the proletarians. The only way to get rid of this hate that we see, this inequality, and people who are happy with this hate and happy with this inequality and do not wish things to change, cannot be calling themselves socialists, right? It doesn't make sense to join a party of workers. We want to win, and we do want to abolish the capitalist state. Not the state, the capitalist state. Take the state in our hands. Yeah, toppling statues is a good start, but what do you replace them with? The only true reparation for slavery is the abolition of exploitation of man from man. It's the abolition of capitalism. And it is a creative act. It's not just a distraction, it's something we build together, like we build this party. I guess this is the testing ground for us. People who have been despondent, generations that have been raised without this idea of revolution and of wanting to change, needs to change individually and collectively. This is a big test for us, what we are trying to build in this party. If we believe in our power to build a party, if we have the unity to agree to a program, if we can start building blocks that are the demands that we have for this new state, this is the creation. This is the state of workers that we will create again, like the Cubans built a worker state, as you say, as the people of the Soviet Union once did. In a worker state, there will be prisons. And you know who we will put in these prisons? The war criminals, the criminal bosses, the bourgeoisie that starves kids, that have people homeless in the streets. Is there a worse crime than denying people healthcare in this pandemic? That denying them access to hospitals? Is there a worse crime? Do we need to wait for more crimes and more deaths to demand housing and decent education for their children? This is what the worker state means. It means, like we agree in the program, we agree in a constitution that makes homelessness criminal. It makes it a crime, that will be making unemployment a crime, and that will be making homelessness a crime. And I think all workers will stand by this constitution. So this is our struggle, and every demand that we make is a building block towards what we will have, what we will share. And maybe in this way, we will get to the point that you described in Cuba. We will get to the point where we will achieve what Lenin said, which is to have the salaries of the state officials being the equivalent of that of a competent worker. Because in this new state that we want to build, it is the workers that count, and it's the workers' lives, black or white, the proletarians' lives that we will be protected. And that's what we all stand for. And this is the real revolution and the goal.
Thank you, Christina. Very beautifully expressed as always. You greatly move me with your contributions. I want to pick up on just one of the things that you said. They talk about crime and criminals. And it goes without saying, I hope, that we will be tough on crime. We believe in order. We believe in discipline. We will not tolerate anti-social or criminal behavior. But there's small criminals and there's big criminals. It's a joke, actually, but in that joke is a great truth. That if you rob a bank, you'll go to prison forever. If you open a bank and rob everybody else, you'll end up in the House of Lords. Or look at the crime we're witnessing now. In the United States, 116,000 people have perished before their time due to the coronavirus. And in our country, which has a fraction of the population of the United States, we have lost 65,000 people dead. All of them, someone's son, father, brother, mother, wife, husband. There, in just 2 countries, 200,000 people killed in a few months, 3 months, almost all of them, from March until now, by government, state, incompetence, and malevolence. That's a pretty big crime, isn't it? You want to talk about crime? I mean, that's mass murder by anybody's definition. If I told you that some regime somewhere had killed 200,000 of its citizens, you'd say, get them to The Hague, get them on trial, throw them in prison forever. And yet that is what's happened in front of our eyes in just 3 months in 2 of the world's leading imperialist countries. So there's criminals and criminals. There's robbery and robbery. There's murder and there's mass murder. And our ruling class is responsible for the biggest robberies, for the greatest mass murder, and for the absolute neglect represented in the word you picked out, from our program, homelessness, for example. What kind of a society has thousands of people sleeping on the streets, in the bitter cold and wet, in doorways? When the coronavirus hit, we put them all into the empty hotels. And now that we are reopening the economy, we are throwing the homeless back out onto the street. What kind of democracy is that? What kind of society is that? Peter Mandelson, rather unwisely, today talked about the law of the jungle. That's the law of the jungle. You throw homeless people to their almost certain untimely deaths onto the street in the sixth richest economy in the world, a nuclear-armed imperialist power. So our indictment of British capitalism, it doesn't flow from, jealousy or envy. Not at all. By the grace of God and quite a bit of hard work, I have a good life. It's our indignation that drives us. Our indignation at a system responsible for the greatest crimes in human history, and the injustice and inequality that the system has visited upon the masses, generation after generation after generation. And that's what drives our determination to end it or to die trying.
Thank you, George. That's excellent way of looking at the perverse nature of the conditions that we're expected to accept as normal, in this system. Matthew, I'm going to come to you next. You've got a contribution to make.
Hiya, George. I think my question's going to be a bit of an anti-climax after Christina's brilliant speech. How do we ensure going forward that we respect our differences within the party, but don't let those differences fragment the party in the long term to the benefit of the state and the capitalist state? I mean, you only have to look at Labour now. I don't want to see that happen to our party, where there's really nasty backstabbing and betrayals. And, I want us to kind of keep in the ballpark, even if we do have our differences.
Well, that's a good and timely point, Matthew. We partly tried to take care of that by erecting a constitution which would put off from joining us the kind of people we did not want and who would be the most divisive and would lead the party to having to spend more time on internal conflict than on challenging the government, the system, the state, and the role of imperialism in the world. And I don't have to go through the lines in the Constitution which are carefully there to do that. They are obvious. We have sought and will seek always to repel all borders whose ideology, whose intention, whose style of work is not what we think a workers' party needs to be. So, for example, if you are infatuated with identity politics I've said from the beginning, we're not for you. You really shouldn't join us. If you're an anarchist, if you are someone who has drank the Kool-Aid of ultra-leftism, then we're not for you, and you shouldn't join us. And so necessarily, that makes us less big in the short term than we would be, although we are the fastest growing political party in Britain. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt at all. It cannot be otherwise. But it makes us less big in the short term than we could otherwise be if we had not those strictures, but will make us much bigger and much stronger in the medium and long term, because we have a united group of people behind a very clear set of policies and a determination which we, I hope, all share to fight for those policies and win wider acceptance for them amongst the workers in Britain. Having said all of which, of course, there are issues, and we're going to be discussing some of them at the council meeting later this month. There are some issues like UBI, for example, issues, I'm trying to think of others, maybe issues on the lockdown, maybe issues concerning the Black Lives Matter affair. There may be, these issues are perfectly legitimate grounds for disagreement and argument. And the council is a big one. It contains a lot of diverse political opinion within it. And in years to come, that will obviously even be more true, because this is the council elected right at the very beginning. The next council will be much further down the track. And we'll argue these issues openly and in a comradely spirit. And everyone should have that in mind always. But I do see from time to time, it rather disturbs me, people flying our colors on their social media masts, who may or may not be members. We can't stop people flying our colors. They may or may not be members, but it troubles me when I see blue on blue metaphorical violence, people fighting with each other in a way which definitely goes beyond the bounds of comradely disagreement. So I appeal to anyone to whom that might apply, and not to have these arguments in public with other members. There's no need for it, because every Wednesday you can tune in to the members' meeting and say anything that you like, and say anything that you like about what other people like. There's no need at all for public discord, especially now in this time when we have a members' meeting every single week to which any member can come, can attend, and any member can speak and express themselves freely. Thanks, Matthew, for the chance to make those points.
Thank you, George. Yeah, it's important to remember that, you know, we've got a platform for people to participate in these discussions, which happens very regularly. And also, you know, we should take into account that if everyone had thought exactly the same thing about everything joining up this party, it would be a fairly kind of narrow way of working things out. So it's totally acceptable for people to have slightly different views.
Rob, we're a work in progress. We've only been in existence for 6 months, 3 of which we've been under lockdown. So it is remarkable the progress that we've made and the unity we do display, and the unity of purpose and around our program that we do display. Good point.
Excellent. Let's go to Eleonora.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. I wrote a few words that I wanted to say. So it's related to the identity politics kind of things. And it's also about working class unity in those troubled times and why we need to be together and push together. So here my word. There is a saying in France that says that to make a successful revolution, we the people need to push together at the same time. The most important identity that we have is our working class identity. We need working class unity to move towards socialism, as George just said. As a Black person, I identify myself with the stories and testimonies of all the members of the party, like Tess, Georgina, Sam, or John, because it is the same story as mine. It is always a story of permanent struggle and disillusion. It is the story of the toilers of this earth that are trying very hard to find a way to breathe in a system that denies them everything. I identify myself with them because their stories are also tales of hope, of fight, and faith in a better tomorrow. We in this party are looking together toward the same future, and it's a bright one that awaits us, I believe. This is why I invite all the workers watching this and who are not yet in the party to join us and fight with us, because I know that they want the same things as us. Don't let our differences put us apart. We have more in common than what they say. We as workers want dignified and meaningful life, a clear future for our kids, a peaceful world where we all live in harmony. And this is only possible if we stand together and fight for socialism. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, I was impressed last week, Rob, by our members. I'm impressed again this evening. That's simply beautiful poetry that we have just heard from Eleanor. And I wouldn't seek to improve upon it. I couldn't improve upon it. And I hope her words are heard widely. One of the good things that our comrades in the propaganda department, if I can put it that way, are doing is clipping these kind of contributions and sending them out in the ether, where I'm sure they will have a very positive effect on the public who can hear them, because 500,000 people have watched the long version. But as I know from the mother of all talk shows, the task is to get 500,000 people to watch the long show and another million to watch short clips of the long show, because that way we multiply our penetration into the public's consciousness, which we are doing fantastically well. So I'm sure that Eleanor's contribution will be clipped, and I'm sure it will find a very ready audience. And it's never been more vitally important that contribution is heard, because there are a lot of people, black and white, who imagine somehow that our differences are more important than that which we have in common. As I've said here many, many times, we all have lots of identities, whether it's Celtic, the Catholic Church, our sexual orientation, the color of our skin, our ethnic origin, and so on. We've all got. I don't know if there's any Rangers supporters in the party yet, but if there are, I welcome them, truly, because our overarching identity is the big enchilada. Not just because it obviously is true that the thing that affects your life most is whether you're poor or rich, whether you have a secure job or not, whether your children are hungry or well fed. This is about class. But it's not just that obvious moral point. It's that only the working class as a whole can change it. Because only the working class as a whole constitutes the majority. If you collected all the gay people, all the black people, all the Catholic people, all whatever other identities we have, they are not in themselves capable of overthrowing capitalism, ending imperialism. But if you put us all together as a working class movement, we are unstoppable. If the workers come together, they are literally unstoppable. And that's why we strive for unity. Thanks, Eleanor.
Thanks, George. That's really hits the nail on the head, that last way of explaining it that you've put it there. And Eleanor, you're getting a lot of applause in the chat here for your contribution. Now I'm going to go to Georgina.
Hello. Oh no, how do I follow that? Hi, George.
Hi, Georgie.
Inspiring meeting as usual. And I'm going to sound like a sour grape, but I feel that I've been misled and manipulated by the Labour Party. And I feel a bit stupid about that, a bit gormless. But I'm really glad I've left there and joined our party, because I feel that I'm getting an education as well as fellowship. And I've got that camaraderie that I didn't always get, as we've alluded to, Matthew was talking about earlier, in the Labour Party. For goodness sake, I was even suspended for allegedly being anti-Semitic when I think I'd been on a Palestinian solidarity campaign march. Anyway, whatever. So that was that. But I did also think that even if our horrible lot in the Labour Party, I say our, hadn't thrown 2 elections and Corbyn had become Prime Minister, if we'd remained members of the EU, we wouldn't have been able to carry out his transformative policies anyhow. What do you think about that, George?
Well, I absolutely agree. And it will forever be a source of bemusement to me that not only Corbyn, who is not actually a very ideological person, he has good socialist instincts and a cast of mind and a long record of fighting for good things. But he's not actually, I don't want to insult him, but he's not a particularly well-read or a particularly ideological person, not a theoretical person in any way. But others, like John MacDonald, who was quite the opposite, was as nasty as Corbyn was nice, and was as ideologically fixed as Corbyn was not, fell for the Starmer-led attempt to try and wreck Brexit, when both of them literally sat right next to me through the night, over and over again, as we tried to wreck the Maastricht Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. Their opposition to the European Union was absolutely militant and vibrant and clear, right up until the point that they had an open goal in front of them when the British people voted to leave the damn thing. All they were required to say was, well, whatever your point of view on the EU, the people have spoken, we must implement the referendum decision. It didn't even require them to side with the Brexit campaign. All they had to do was harness the democratic, obvious democratic compulsion, order from the British people that we must now leave. And they fell for instead this attempt to wreck Brexit. And I feel particularly bad about it because I can't go into the private details, never mind my private communications, but my public communications for, it seems to me now like years, it was 3 years, I warned them over and over again of the obvious outcome of this. I forget the numbers now, but I used to read them out by rote. Of the seats you need to win, almost all of them voted Brexit. Of the seats you're most likely to lose, almost all of them voted for Brexit. You really don't need to be Einstein to work this out. What you're doing is not just politically and ideologically, historically wrong. It is electorally, cephalogically insanity. And I screamed this through every microphone I could find and communicated it endlessly every single day of my life, 7 days a week. And yet they still did it. And the outcome is precisely what anyone with half a brain could have predicted. So that's why I use the word bemusement. I will not actually ever understand it, especially as it was surely obvious to them that for Starmer and his like, for Blair and Mandelson and so on, it was a win-win situation. Either they wrecked Brexit or they got rid of Corbyn and took the Labour Party back. I mean, could they not see that? All these clever people with their Oxford and Cambridge degrees and so on, could they not see that their enemies were pushing them to do something that was a win-win for them and a lose-lose for the Labour leader and his closest circle? No doubt memoirs will be being written, and we'll get further and better particulars in due course, and I'll be here to let you know whether you can believe those memoirs or not, because there's nothing about this that I don't know. Just remember that if you're writing the memoirs. Thank you.
Great to get some of these insights here, George. Let's go to Helen here.
Thanks, Rob. Going back to, something, following on from that, George, I don't think the Labour Party deserves to have the loyalty from the members that they do get. They've treated them so badly, the membership, and still continue to do this. And I just don't understand why anybody would stay in the Labour Party. Going back to what to Jeremy Corbyn, he was always at his best, I think, and he got the best reception when he talked about jobs, and he talked about the National Health Service and housing and the homeless and things that really affect ordinary people and things like that. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do as much as he could, or talk about it even as much as he could, because he was spending all his time fending off these ridiculous attacks. Everything from having a beard to not bowing low enough, to being a Russian stooge, to being a raving anti-Semite and racist. If they think Jeremy Corbyn was a threat, wait till you get into that position, George. how will you deal with it with them? You will deal with that. I'm sure you will.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that kind thought. A good friend of mine in Glasgow, a Rangers supporter actually called Bob Wiley, always put it this way, though I'll leave out the swear words. They hated me because I really mean it. I really mean it. If I ever get the chance, they're getting it. And that's not the same as most Labour politicians who could be counted on. You know, the carpets are deep, the armchairs sumptuous, the wages good, the gongs and rewards plentiful. It's easy and cheap actually, to seduce most left-wing politicians. You can buy them really rather cheaply. But I was never a part of that scene. They used to say I was a lone wolf and not clubbable and so on, and that was true. I didn't go to bars, I didn't go to parties, I didn't go to any of the things that the elite use to lure people who start out with good intentions down the path of ill intention. But on the Labour Party loyalty, you're absolutely correct. Here is a block of some hundreds of thousands of people, the prime purpose of whose headquarters was to isolate, marginalize, insult, and if possible, expel. And they did expel. Maybe 100,000 people were either expelled or suspended or blocked, all to ensure that Corbyn lost the election in 2016 when the coup against him was mounted. And yet you still have people. Of course, they're led by useful idiots like Paul Mason, who's gone from being an ultra-left Trotskyite zealot to a supporter of NATO and Sir Keir Starmer, and who is active all day trying to persuade the so-called momentum activists that their future lies not in an adversarial relationship to Sir Keir Starmer, but in a supportive role to Sir Keir Starmer. And Owen Jones and the Novara media luxury communists crowd, they've all gone over to the Sir Keir Starmer camp. But there are scores of thousands of Labour members who should be with us, who think like us, who think about Starmer and Blair and the power like we do. And these are our targets. It's to them I'm primarily speaking. There is no future in Keir Starmer's Labour Party for you. You will be lucky not to be expelled from it. You will certainly never prosper in it. And if you prospered, then it would mean sacrificing everything you believe in. Because Keir Starmer is very clear about where he stands and what kind of role he intends the Labour Party to play. So you have a future of remaining in the Labour Party and fighting against the rest of the Labour Party, the majority in the Labour Party, or join us and fight capitalism. Join us and fight imperialism. Which is the more attractive option? If you think about it, which is the best way to spend whatever remaining time you have on this earth? Fighting for what you believe in, or fighting inside an organization that doesn't believe what you believe in the hope that one day you might get back some of what you briefly had under Jeremy Corbyn. Although, of course, you won't, because they'll now rewrite the rules in a way that make that completely impossible. So I think our offer to Labour Party members and Labour Party activists, which will always remain open, is an attractive offer. You'll have much more fun. It'll be much better for your soul to be with us than to remain in the poisoned lake of Labourism.
That's very true. And I see the evidence of it in people's conversations every day. Let's go to Ian.
Evening, George.
Hello, Ian.
All right. Yeah, what I want to say, I think if there was a murderer living in your street or in your town, and it was well known that he was a murderer, and he was getting away with it every day of the week, and not only that, but he was being promoted for it, I think the majority of people in that town would be pretty upset. That's the way I feel every day about our government. So I think if the people of Britain knew the complicity they had in the murder of people around the world, the murder of children in Yemen, the role of the RAF, the lies they tell about Venezuela, the lies they tell about Cuba, the lies they tell about China. If the people knew, the British people, I mean, I've got faith in the British people, and I believe if they were told the truth, bones and all, that they would stand up. They would stand up for socialism. They would come and join our party in droves. But obviously, they're not. They don't know. You know, they're lied to on a daily basis. They're conditioned by the BBC, by the media. It's you know, like I say, I just feel so bitter and angry every time I see those people on the TV. You know, in the daily briefings, and I'm sat there looking at people who are complicit in the deaths of so many people, and I know the anger that I feel would, you know, the majority of British people would feel if they actually knew what the truth was.
Well, look, I think that's absolutely correct, Ian, and that's a big incentive for us to get out amongst the British people to tell them that truth and to persuade them of it. Because like you, I have faith that if they knew, they would be with us. I'm not one of these who believes that human beings are essentially, you know, evil or selfish or whatever. I believe the opposite. I believe there are contradictory impulses in all of us, and therefore in all societies. But if you work to encourage the best side of people, you find that there are many millions of good people in this country that would like our country to be better and are ready to do the right thing to make it better. And you find them everywhere. You find them, you know, in the church, you find them in the union, you find them in the local community organization, in parent teachers associations, you find them everywhere. And it's our job to persuade them that things are not as they are by accident, that we don't have the leaders that we have because we've been unlucky. We are where we are because of the state that we're in, the system that we have. And the only profoundly changing these things can lead down that better path to a better future. And I'm confident that we can do that. And in a way, we're already doing it. If I had said to you 6 months ago that 500,000 people would listen to these meetings in 6 months, that thousands of people would be following us, signing up, joining us. If I said that to you, you'd have said I was being a trifle optimistic, but I wasn't. And we're racking up numbers precisely because we are beginning to fill a vacuum. Because every country needs a Labour Party, a Workers' Party that stands for socialism, and Britain didn't have one until we came along. And now that Britain has one, it's up to us to proselytize for it, to evangelize for it, to win people to it. And I'm confident about our future. Thank you very much indeed. Is there time for one more, or is that us, Rob?
We've come right up to 5:30 now. So I think that'll be that we have to sign off. There have been more contributions, but to remind the members here that are taking part, please do log on tomorrow evening for the members' discussion meeting, which you're all welcome to join. There's likely a lot more members watching in, tuning in to these meetings on the online streaming, on YouTube and etc. So please do get along and join for the meeting tomorrow night. And of course, for everyone else, be good to see you again next week. And anyone who's watching, if you're not already involved, please do sign up and get involved with us. Come along to the meetings. As we say, it will be good for you. So thanks very, very much, George, and good night.
Thank you, Rob.